It is my pleasure to introduce to you all Dr. Theodora Chaspari. She's an assistant professor at the Computer Science and Engineering Department in Texas A&M. She received her Bachelor of Science in ECE from National Technical University of Athens, Greece, and she received her MS and PhD in electrical engineering from University of Southern California. Before this, she has worked as a research assistant in the Signal Analysis and Interpretation Lab, and she also has done some cool internships at Disney Research. So Theodora's interests are in areas of effective computing, signal processing, data science, and machine learning. She has received several awards. To name a few, she received the USC Annenberg Graduate Fellowship, USC Women in Science and Engineering Merit Fellowship, and the Texas A&M Computer Science and Engineering Graduate Faculty Teaching Excellence Award. And she has published in numerous venues, top-tier conferences, and her work is supported by several federal agencies, including Let us give a warm welcome to Theodora. I know we can't clap. See. Okay. I request again all of you to mute yourself, and if you have any questions, please type them in the chat window, and either you can personally read them at the end, or I can read them to Theodora at the end. With that, Theodora, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and thank you everyone for this warm welcome. It's very nice to be with you today, even electronically. So today's talk, we're going to discuss about a computational framework for modeling and analyzing human behavior. And specifically, we're going to see we're going to see how the integration of data scientific solutions and machine learning approaches can afford us a better understanding.
Excuse me, Theodora, 1 second. Somebody has not muted themselves. Mehdi, can you please mute yourself? I request again, please mute yourself other than the speaker. Mehdi, I think you did mute yourself still. Can you please do that? Sorry, Theodora, go ahead.
No worries. So what we're going to do is we're going to see how the integration of data analytics techniques and machine learning solutions can help us obtain new insights about human behavior that can be translated into promoting human well-being, health, and education applications. So human behavior is a multifaceted phenomenon that includes the interaction of the mind, the body, and the brain. We have a couple of different ways with which we can get access into human behavior. We have what we call overt behavioral cues, which mostly contain speech signals, facial expressions, body postures, and body gestures, which indicate people's communicative intent. Like, for example, when we have, it has been shown that, for example, people with depression have a slightly different tone in their voice and a slightly different impression in their facial expression compared to their healthy counterparts. And apart from these overt behavioral cues, we also we have what we call covert biosignals. And by that we mean that we have signals for which we cannot really observe them with our human eye, but we can use some type of sensing devices in order to observe them. Such signals can give us access into a person's heart activity, brain activity, sweat activity, and can complement the overt behavioral cues. So apart from this, another factor that really affects human behavior is the interaction of an individual with the other people, as well as environmental factors that can be that can elicit different reactions of a human. So we're going to see how we can integrate several aspects of this in order to better model and better quantify human behavior. So in this endeavor, what we're going to see is that we're going to show how overt signal information and covert biomarkers can be integrated with machine learning solutions in order to provide us better quantification and better understanding of several facets of human behavior. Either these are cognitive facets, emotional facets, or sometimes interactive facets between individuals. And we're going to see how these can help us develop new algorithmic and engineering solutions and promote scientific discovery. So in this endeavor, we have several things that can help us towards that. First of all, there has been a lot of development in wearable technology in the last 10 years. And why this is important for our endeavor is because this now enables us to transfer what we were doing in the lab, the measurements that usually psychologists and human science experts used to have in the lab. And now we can translate those measurements and we can observe aspects of human behavior in the real world. So the empirical validity of these studies can actually increase. But with this also we have a lot of disadvantages that come, and basically limitations are to the fact that we have noisy data and sometimes data that are affected by variable factors. We also have Internet of Things technologies that can help us complement the measurements that we get from all the wearable devices. So for example, we have GPS coordinates that can help us understand where a person is at a given point, and this can really increase.
Professor, how are you, Manny? Very well. Is it bad?
And then beyond that, we also have applications that are related to people's medical intakes, people's dietary information. So all these can really help integrate and complement the information that we get from the wearable device. So, beyond these opportunities, there are several challenges that come with this endeavor and that we are also trying to tackle. The first challenge comes from the high inter-individual variability across individuals. So every person is kind of unique. The way another person gets angry, for example, the way one couple expresses and experiences conflict might be different from the way another couple expresses or experiences conflict. So we're trying to develop group-specific, or what we call subpopulation-specific machine learning models that try to integrate this inter-individual variability and potentially help us obtain more accurate decisions about the behavioral outcomes that we are modeling. The second challenge that we are trying to tackle is the finite amount of human resources that results in a small amount of labeled data that we can get. We can understand that when we have longitudinal data from individuals that are being recorded 24/7, we can do that much in actually obtaining human labels. So as part of the second part of the talk, we are going to see how we can leverage more simple data or more constrained data that are being obtained from ambulatory environments, but for which we have very well-defined labels, and how we can leverage those in order to boost the accuracy of our systems. And finally, another aspect that we have been working lately is the aspect of preserving privacy in the machine learning models and in the data that we are capturing. You can understand that now that we have all these wearable and ambulatory devices, there are a lot of privacy-related aspects that arise and might cause several concerns from the public. So we are going to examine one of these aspects, which refers to the anonymity of individuals and how we can develop machine learning models that can preserve preserve the anonymity of the individuals. So going now to our first part of the talk, we're going to discuss a little bit more about our subpopulation and group-specific machine learning models. So in behavioral sciences and in life sciences, it has long been observed that individuals have high variability in how they express themselves, in how they experience their emotions, and how they express their behaviors in general. Specifically, there has been several findings that, for example, argue that personality really affects different the brain activation under the same stimuli. For example, agreeable people might have different measures of social interaction for which we can predict their mood, while this might not happen for other types of personalities. In similar ways, people with have positive coping strategies might not get as stressed or might not get as high physiological reactivity under the same stressor events with people with, compared to people with negative coping strategies. So what we tried to do is that we tried to integrate some of these personal traits, personal characteristics of people into the proposed machine learning models. In this work, in this thread of work, there have been several previous efforts which have tried to integrate inter-individual variability. So the first effort really refers to what we call individual or separate models, and these are models that have been trained and learned for each specific person separately. So this means that I'm 100 people, and I train 100 different models for each person. So the main drawback for this is, first of all, that we might not really have enough data to robustly train a model from a person. And another important drawback might be that because usually human behavior is related to outcomes that are not usually seen. So for example, when we model conflict in couples, usually couples will not have 24 hours a day conflict. So these outcomes of interest can be very sparse. And for this, we might not have all the subjects of interest having as many outcomes that can be of interest. Therefore, this really imposes a big threat into the generalizability of our models. Now, a second thread of work has been on ensemble methods. So these ensemble methods, what they have done is that they have tried to take decisions using the individuals that are most closely to the test sample. There has been a couple of promising results from these ensemble methods. The main data sets in order to work, and the information from all samples is not necessarily incorporated. While hierarchical learning models can incorporate information from all subjects in their first levels of hierarchies, and then they can really refine this information from all subjects into a specific individual or into groups of individuals for which we suspect that they might share common feature representations. So we have followed this hierarchical learning approach into designing subpopulation specific machine learning models. The contributions of our proposed work are first that we're trying to bridge theory-driven hypotheses with data-augmented findings, which means that we are grouping people according to theoretically postulated groupings rather than just trying to see what we can guess from our data. While there is also a value from having data related groupings. Now we are also trying to formulate this in a hierarchical learning approach where we are trying to integrate both context and individual characteristics. And we have also demonstrated that the proposed subpopulation specific machine learning models can actually work in a span of a couple of applications that range from well-being and education. So the applications that we have worked on are mostly applications that are related to family well-being, education applications that are related to public speaking anxiety, and some applications that are related to performance and stress at work. We are going to discuss mostly about the first two, but I'm happy to discuss more about the last application as well. So in general, what we're trying to do here, if I were to summarize what we're going to show in this part, is that we're going to try to see how we can formulate theory-driven hypotheses so that we can group our subpopulations into theoretically postulated ways. We're going to see how this population clustering is being performed and whether we can get some valuable insights from this subpopulation clustering. And then we're going to see how we have actually trained these hierarchical machine learning models and what are the results that we get from this and what is the comparison of this with general machine learning models that do not really take this personalization into account. So now to the first part of the applications that we have, which refers to family well-being. This is actually motivated by collaborations that we had with several studies at USC, where we tried to see how we can model and how we can detect couples' interpersonal conflict from ambulatory data. So interpersonal conflict is really known about its deleterious effects, not only for family well-being applications, but also for work applications. Very specifically, with respect to family well-being, we know that various types of couples express and experience conflict in different ways. So couples with, let's say, avoidant coping styles might express conflict in different way compared to couples with less avoidant conflict styles. Or relationship satisfaction also plays a very important role there. So we're trying to see how we can incorporate all this into better predicting conflict in ambulatory data. For this, we used the data from 87 couples. Data collections involved a smartphone device and a wearable sensor. And then our labels come from self-reported conflict from each partner within the last hour. So the types of features that we used in order to try to model conflict for these couples are, first of all, physiological features. So we captured electrodermal activity from wearable devices. This refers to sweat activity. We also captured heart activity, and specifically we measured things related to heart rate and heart rate variability. We also measured physiological synchrony between the two people. Physiological synchrony is a construct that has been related to conflict, which means that when once sweat activity goes up, if people are in conflict, then potentially the other person's sweat activity will also go up. So this is how this physiological synchrony has been modeled. We also tried to combine acoustic characteristics from couples. So essentially, people's so really, if pitch, which means that the frequency of the fundamental frequency of speech increases, then this really reflects that there is some change in people's underlying emotion. There has been a lot of studies about pitch and when people are angry or when people are happy as well. We also incorporated characteristics about the language from the two people that we're trying to model. So constructs that are related to people's psychology, personal concerns, work-related concerns. We also incorporated personal pronouns. Examples of personal pronouns is that we counted the number of words I and the number of words you, because it has been actually demonstrated in previous research that when people really say the word you many times, this refers to more blaming characteristics compared to when they say, I think that you did not do the dishes versus you never do the dishes. One is more blaming than the other, as well as paralinguistic constructs, so sighs, laughters, and fears. Finally, we also tried to complement the features that we had with contextual information. So we also measured GPS coordinates, activity, body temperature, alcohol, caffeine, and medication consumption, because these can affect the physiological reactivity for our signals. So after having all these features, what we tried to do is that we tried to see what are theoretically postulated characteristics that can affect the way people express their conflict. And we went back to the couples literature with the help of our collaborators from psychology, and we saw that different types of characteristics, mostly related to, in general, how positive or how negative a person is, in general, how stressed a person is, can affect the way these people express their conflict. So these two were individually related characteristics. characteristics. Because of the nature of the study, we also augmented this with relationship-specific characteristics. So two of the most important ones are overall relationship satisfaction. So how satisfied overall people were from their relationship, as well as how close to each other people felt. And this actually is depicted by avoidance and anxiety. So people usually who are more anxious and more avoidant about the relationship do not feel that close compared to people who are less anxious and less avoidant with respect to their partner. These characteristics are characteristics that are obtained only through a one-time self-assessed reports. So they are not being obtained overall, but these are just general trait characteristics that can describe overall the person and the relationship. So after that, what we did is that we obtained those. We just applied principal component analysis in order to have a more compact and compressed space. And then we clustered the couples according to these characteristics. And then we found three populations that were pretty separable from each other, population 1, population 2, and population 3. And then we tried to see what are these three populations that we are getting. So overall, we plot the same PCA dimensions, but in the axis of relationship satisfaction and relationship avoidance and anxiety. We can see here overall that there is an inversely proportional trend, which means that people with higher relationship satisfaction are usually less anxious and less avoidant about the relationship, and vice versa. So we can see here these three clusters. We can see that clusters 1 and 2, which are these extreme clusters here, the green one and the yellow one, are the ones that have lower relationship satisfaction, higher relationship satisfaction. And then we went to these clusters and we tried to see which features were most reflective of conflict for these two subpopulations of couples. And we saw that for these subpopulations, we got most discriminant features that are related to physiological reactivity. So this means that people who were mostly in the extremes of very low or very high relationship satisfaction, when they argued, physiological reactivity characteristics were most prominent of their conflict. Why? When we go to this intermediate group, for this intermediate group, we needed some more fine-grained characteristics, like some acoustic characteristics that might be able to capture more fine-grained fluctuations in speech that might be related to conflict. So, interesting observations from this clustering. After performing this clustering, what we tried to do is that we tried to predict and detect actually conflict from the features that we have using these clusters. So for this, we used a multitask learning approach. This is just a simple multitask neural network. This multitask learning approach could have been implemented even with adaptation techniques or more conventional multitask learning approaches as well. So what we did, we trained the first layers of this multitask neural network, the first hierarchies, using data from all samples. And then in the latter parts of the network, we separated our three populations and we trained these later parts of the network for each population separately. So this part of the network is trained for population 1, the second part is trained for population 2, and the third part is trained for population 3. And again, the outcome of each of these nodes of the network was the presence or the absence of conflict within the last hour. We also compared this multitask learning approach with two different approaches. So one was just a general model, a fully connected neural network, which was trained and tested using our entire population. And the other approach was separate models that were trained separately for each population. So a smaller neural network trained for population 1, another smaller neural network trained for population 2, and so forth and so on. So these were the results that we got from our approaches. We saw that the subpopulation-specific approach outperformed slightly both the separate models, which were trained for its subpopulation separately, as well as the general model, which was trained using all our data. So what this indicate were that actually clustering people with respect to these theory postulated characteristics findings that might be indicative of the outcome that we want to model can actually provide valuable information and can actually boost the performance of general machine learning models. Another interesting thing was that the separate machine learning models, so separately training a model for its subpopulation, was slightly worse. I think also that was a significant difference compared to a subpopulation specific model. And why this was the case most probably is because the subpopulation specific model really incorporates all general characteristics. If you can think about it, you can think about it in the way that you might have a pre-trained model, which is pre-trained with everyone. So this model kind of learns some general representations of conflict, and then you go and fine-tune these general representations of conflict for the subpopulation that you are interested in. So we got similar results. These results were when we combined all sensor data, so physiological data, acoustic data, linguistic data, and contextual data. These results were with the best two modalities for its model. And again, similar trends were found there. These were our results that we got about our family well-being application. After that, we also we had another project where we were trying to model public speaking anxiety of students, and then we tried to see whether these results or similar findings could be replicated for modeling different aspects of human behavior, so more cognitive aspects of human behavior that are related to public speaking anxiety. So that was a study that we performed last year in our lab. Why we were motivated by this study was, first of all, because public speaking anxiety ranks as a top social phobia among many people. Recruiters and managers really say that what they are looking for people to hire is people who are really capable in communicating properly and in an effective way. Public speaking anxiety, we know that it leads to high levels of physiological reactivity, a lot of negative cognition or negative thoughts, for example, I'm performing poorly, as well as tangible behavioral reactions like some trembling sometimes. So the overall scope of this project is that we are trying to develop adaptive training interfaces that adapt to people's public speaking anxiety and then provide them feedback during training so that they can help them cope with their public speaking anxiety. There have been studies which support that in-the-moment interventions and in-the-moment feedback can actually help people restructure their cognitive views about some how much this in-the-moment feedback can benefit in comparison to more traditional interventions, let's say a retrospective feedback after the public speaking training task. So in order to do that, this is just the first step of these adaptive training interfaces in which we are trying to predict public speaking anxiety while it is happening. So we are going to see how these subpopulation specific machine learning models can actually help us predict more reliably public speaking anxiety compared to general models. Of course, with respect to public speaking anxiety, there has been an extensive work that has been performed primarily in psychology and communication sciences. And of course, there has been also some work in affective computing and human-computer interaction that has tried also to incorporate, to model public speaking anxiety. In our work, we're trying to incorporate three main aspects of these components that have been studied separately in psychology and communication, as well as in affective computing. So we're trying to incorporate biobehavioral indices, mainly physiology and speech. We are also trying to incorporate individual and contextual factors, individual traits, and then at a later point we will also try to incorporate interventions and see how from these interventions we can incorporate biobehavioral indices and machine learning systems in order to make those interventions a little bit better or a little bit more effective. So in our experiments, what we did last year is that we recruited 50 people. We designed an experimental setup in which was segmented into three parts. We had a pre-part in which that served as a baseline. So we wanted to see at which point each individual starts, like how stressed are they when they perform an individual task. So this was what we called a pre-session, where each individual came to the lab. They first completed some self-reports. They also were given a task, an article, in order to prepare for 10 minutes. And then after that, they entered another room. And in this room, they had to present their article in front of an audience for 4 to 5 minutes. So that was the pre-session. Then the test session was the part of the training. In the training, instead of having a real audience for the training, which would have been very much impractical, and it couldn't really replicate as many settings as we wanted to replicate, we decided to go with a virtual reality interface in which we provided participants with 8 different training sessions. So in these sessions, people were presented with different virtual reality stimuli, and then they had to perform the same process, where they were given first an article. They had to prepare this article of general knowledge for 10 minutes, and then they had 5 minutes to present their article in front of a virtual reality audience. There has been a lot of work that tries to assess how real life audience and virtual reality audience, how comparable these are. Of course, we know that they're not fully and 100% comparable, but we also saw in our data several cases where the virtual reality audience could actually elicit genuine behavioral reactions from the participant, and sometimes quite genuine as the real life audience. And finally, we wanted to see how much this training through the virtual reality interfaces has actually affected participants' views on public speaking anxiety. That is why we performed a post session that was comparable to the pre. So again, the participant, after the training, they went back to the post session, and then they had to present another article in front of a virtual audience. So overall, we tried to answer 3 research questions there. The first research question was whether we can quantify public speaking anxiety from wearable-based data. Second, whether group-specific or subpopulation-specific models of public speaking anxiety can actually help and help us better quantify public speaking anxiety. And finally, whether systematic exposure to this virtual reality training, whether this can actually mitigate some stress reactivity patterns. So this is an overall outline of the data that we got. We recorded speech data because there is a lot of evidence in speech that, for example, the trembling of the voice is related to how stressed a person is when they are speaking in public. We also collected data that is related to sweat activity and heart activity. So we had people wear this Empatica E4 sensor. The virtual reality interfaces would use the Oculus Rift headset. So overall, we got 82 real-life presentations and 216 virtual reality presentations, and around 10,000 minutes of data. These are the features that we had from the data. So we separated our features into what we call wrist-worn physiological measures, and these are measures that are obtained just from the E4 device, so just from sweat activity and acceleration and temperature. The second group of measures were chest-worn physiological measures, so mostly these referred to heart rate measures and more detailed and fine-grained heart rate measures. And then in terms of acoustic measures, we measured loudness, pitch, which is the same as the fundamental frequency, number of pauses, jitter and shimmer, which reflects how shimmery one's voice is, as well as zero crossing grade, which reflects the speaking rate. So, of course, we wanted to incorporate some individual factors in order to design subpopulation-specific machine learning models. So we tried to incorporate factors that are related to demographics, such as age, gender, education, ethnicity, as well as factors that are related to psychological trait characteristics, such as trait anxiety and personality. So, going back to answer our first question, which was how can we quantify public speaking anxiety from wearable-based physiological signals? First of all, what we try to see how the 3 modalities, how efficient they are in quantifying public speaking anxiety, we saw that the best modality were the chest-worn sensors, which are mostly the sensors related to heart rate variability and heart rate, followed by acoustic signals. After that, we tried to see whether combining multiple modalities together might actually help us have better results. So then what we saw was that combining the chest-worn measures with the wrist-worn measures, so combining electrodermal activity with heart activity and some acceleration patterns can boost up our results. And the same can happen when we combine acoustic measures with heart rate measures. So this gives us some indication that overall, we are able to somehow predict public speaking anxiety from the wearable-based signals that we got. As a second question, we tried to see how group-specific models of public speaking anxiety can help better predict public speaking anxiety. So what we saw there, we tried to see whether from the physiological measures, which were the wrist-worn and the chest-worn measures, how this can be augmented by adding several individual characteristics. So here, for example, we saw that when we add psychological factors related to trait-based anxiety and personality in our models, this actually can augment the performance of the machine learning models rather than only having physiological signals. Here, we also observed something very interesting about the combination of acoustic and chest-worn signals. So in this combination, when we add factors that are related to language, ethnicity, and recency of public speaking presentation, we can actually get a pretty significant boost in the performance. We speculate that this happens because in our population, we had native English speakers as well as non-native English speakers. So augmenting the acoustic feature space with the person's native language, information about how a person's native language, that can actually help, because also public speaking is something that's very much related to one's native language. So then we also tried to divide people based on their traits. This is an example where we have people's trait anxiety with the extraversion scale. What we see is that people who are generally more anxious are less extrovert and vice versa. And we see that we got four different populations based on this clustering. And then after we performed this clustering, we also tried to train similar group-specific machine learning models. And again, we observed similar patterns. The pattern was that the group-specific machine learning model could actually perform better compared to the general machine learning model. So these were some interesting results, some encouraging results that kind of indicate that incorporating again these individual traits and individual characteristics can actually boost the performance of general machine learning models, and it can be very valuable in yield. Briefly going into the third research question about whether systematic exposure to public speaking encounters can alleviate public speaking anxiety, we saw that comparing our individuals before and after the virtual reality training, we see a small drop, which is significant in communication anxiety, in state anxiety, as well as the personal report of public speaking anxiety. These are just all self-reported measures of how a person perceives a public speaking task. But we also saw several interesting findings in terms of physiological reactivity. So we saw decreased physiological reactivity between the pre and the post in terms of both sweat activity and heart activity. Of course, in order to be able to more reliably compare this, we need a control group. And at this point, we're also working on obtaining a control group to more reliably compare these results. So this was the outline of our work with respect to subpopulation and group-specific machine learning models. As going to the next part of the work, what we tried to see there is that we tried to see whether we can somehow address the scarcity of labeled data that exist in human-related applications. Again, like let's say when we had our couples data, when we recorded data for a couple of days, 24 hours each day, obtaining human labels and most importantly obtaining also annotated labels can be a very expensive task. So what we tried to do there, we tried to see whether we can use properly labeled in-lab data in order to more reliably detect several facets of behavior in spontaneous data. And we went and formulated our problem in terms of emotion recognition. So first of all, what we did is that we tried to test some of these techniques in publicly available data sets of emotion that are worked well in the affective computing literature. And actually, we really know what we're going, because we didn't want to just go ahead and test the algorithms in fully unconstrained settings to begin with. So the way we formulated this problem is that we were motivated, first of all, by the fact that speech, we're trying to perform experiments with speech. First of all, because there are a lot of publicly available speech data sets that are related to emotion. We wanted to see how we can get knowledge between acted speech, and we can pre-train models with acted speech, and then how this can be translated to spontaneous speech. For this reason, we tried to answer the following research questions. First of all, whether transfer learning methods can outperform in-domain training, where we have, let's say, models that are both trained and tested on the spontaneous data. We also wanted to see whether multiple sources of data can benefit performance, as well as whether there are desired properties between the source and target data, as well as within the target data that can help us towards getting better models. Of course, there has been a lot of work in transfer learning and domain adaptation, specifically with respect to emotion recognition from speech. There has been a lot of work on adaptive support vector machines, sparse autoencoders, and some work on progressive neural networks. There also has been several works on unsupervised learning. In this proposed work, what we tried to do is that we tried to see how we can formulate the problem specifically between between transferring models between scripted and spontaneous speech, because there is actually a value, a practical and pragmatical value in doing that, because if we have that, then we can translate these models for real life, completely ambulatory applications. And then we wanted to see beyond the single source adaptation, we wanted to see whether multiple source adaptation can actually have a potential good benefit into the final performance of the models. So we use these publicly available data sets. Most people most probably are not familiar with these data sets, I'm not sure, but most of them are data that are uttered in English with different durations and different number of participants. So these were the scripted data sets, which means that these were data that where participants had to utter in the lab a specific sentence with a specific emotion, let's say with the emotion of anger, happiness, and sadness. And then we wanted to pre-train our models in these source data sets, which include scripted speech, and see how these pre-trained models can be adapted into this spontaneous speech data set, which includes spontaneous speech, acoustic measures that are related to the intonation of speech, motor-based parameters, and spectral features. We employed two adaptation techniques. What is most probably familiar to everyone, neural network fine-tuning, as well as a multi-source progressive neural network. What this network does is that, let's say that we have two different sources of active data here. We have two networks that are separately trained for data 1 and data 2, and then the representations, the embeddings from these networks are also the input of this final fully connected network, which is trained both on the target data as well as takes into account the learned representations from the source data. So these were a couple of results that we found from these transfer learning techniques. First of all, we found that just fine-tuning all the layers of a feed-forward neural network actually can perform very decently. This is this line here. These are the single source experiments, which means that in this case we use this data set as the source and the spontaneous data set as our target, and the same things here. We also obtained another very interesting finding in that if the source and target data set are closer to each other, which is also very intuitive, then their combination actually performs better compared to data sets that are a little bit further away from each other, which means that domain adaptation techniques actually work better when inherently the feature spaces are closer to each other. We also tried our multi-source experiments. So in the multi-source experiments, actually we saw a small boost with respect to the single source experiments. And another interesting thing that we also saw there was that if we have different sources of data sets that have higher divergence between the two, and higher divergence might also reflect to how complementary these two sources of data are, then this can actually boost the performance compared to having two data sets that are very similar to each other. Intuitively, we understand that if we have source data that can provide different types of information, then transfer learning might actually happen better, and then the new model might actually take advantage of the multiple sources of different sources of information that are inherent in the source data. So these were some results that we found in terms of domain adaptation and transfer learning between transferring knowledge from scripted speech into spontaneous speech. We are now working, and we have a small paper that has provided several encouraging results into how we can use these data sets to predict stress in our public speaking anxiety data. And then as a latest thing, what we also tried to see is that we tried to see whether we can try to perform fully unsupervised learning techniques using distance-based learning and CMS networks. We got some promising results out of this, but this is something that we are still keep working on, and we're hoping to get better results out of this as well. But still, we got some promising results here. So in terms of transfer learning and how we can try to address the scarcity of human-related labels, we saw that transfer learning techniques with scripted data can actually benefit emotion recognition of spontaneous data. We are trying also to see how we can perform multimodal transfer learning, because of course human behavior is multimodal. So we would like to see how we can leverage that, as well as some unsupervised transfer learning methodologies. So finally, I'm going to take only the last 5 minutes of this presentation, and I'm going to try to describe how we have started to think about privacy-preserving machine learning models. This has been actually something that has motivated us, because when we are trying to capture, let's say, speech data or image data from real-life settings, first of all, this data contain a lot of valuable information. We have seen that physiological data by themselves in ambulatory settings can bring us up to a degree of performance. They can really complement other modalities, but by themselves they cannot work truly well, especially for human behavior. So it is really imperative that we use different modalities, and speech or facial expressions is really a good example of these modalities. But the problem there is that there are a lot of privacy concerns and a lot of anonymity related concerns. Is that we try to see whether we can develop, first of all, we wanted to see how much user-related information is embedded in machine learning models of human behavior. So let's say if we have a neural network that is being trained on emotion, how much speaker-specific information is it in this model that can really track us back to the speaker identity, as well as how can we train machine learning models that can eliminate the speaker-related information. Of course, there has been a lot of work in terms of privacy preservation when people are trying to see how they can manage the consent of different users. There has been a lot of work on authentication and identification. This work on user anonymization mostly reflects to users where they have permissions of the data. So users that might be, let's say, researchers that might want to have permissions from different institutions, that they might want to have permissions recommendations on an interesting data sets, or health providers that they might want to have permissions for different reasons. So there has been quite some work, especially in terms of image processing in this realm. There has been a lot of work on just blurring images, perturbing images, as well as some work on differential privacy aspects. What we're trying to see is that we are trying to see how adversarial learning techniques can help privacy preservation methods for emotion recognition. Previous work has examined these adversarial learning techniques solely in terms of activity recognition. So by activity recognition, we mean walking, sitting, running. There is some value in trying to examine emotion recognition, first of all, because many of the emotion recognition systems are capture data from closed capture cameras. Therefore, whatever the face that we have is very much the entire view that we have from our images. And then also the main difference between emotion recognition and activity recognition is that emotion recognition is usually more subtle. So we really want our machine learning models to be able to still capture subtle expressions related to emotion recognition, but still eliminate speaker-dependent information. So the way we try to do this, first of all, we try to see how just with quantifiable experiments, we can characterize user identification risks. Second, how we can learn transformations that are privacy preserving. And then we try to see how we can evaluate those transformations. We used publicly available datasets for face. We started with face because face is way more intuitive compared to speech. So that is why we wanted to start with some things that were a little bit more intuitive. And we used the yellow faces and the Japanese face datasets that were also augmented through data augmentation. So with respect to the first research question, we tried to see when we have an emotion recognition model, and in this case, the emotion recognition model is represented by this emotion-specific transformation, how much where we impose a speaker-specific transformation on this emotion recognition model, how much speaker-dependent information does this preserve? And how we did this, we just used a very simple convolutional neural network. We trained this convolutional neural network for emotion recognition, and then we tried to see how much these layers of the convolutional neural network, how much speaker-specific information can they actually preserve. For this, what we did is that we used some speaker-specific information and we fine-tuned the last layers of this convolutional neural network with respect to speaker identification. So the results that we got from this, these are the results. This is the accuracy of emotion recognition from the faces. This is the accuracy just from face recognition from another convolutional neural network. And this is the result from face recognition when we first trained on emotion and then we fine-tune on face. And we see essentially that a lot of face-specific information is embedded into these convolutional layers and can really track us back to the speaker-specific information. We also saw that this speaker-specific information is also embedded into the images, into these layers, even when we blur our images. So even if we blur our images, there's also a lot of speaker-dependent information there. And then we wanted to see how much we can really try to learn convolutional layers that might be speaker agnostic, but might still preserve emotion dependent information. So what we did there, we followed this multitask approach where we first had this convolutional layer and then we had two separate layers. Speaker identification, while this second layer here reflects emotion identification. So what we wanted to do is that we wanted to train this convolutional layer here such that it preserves emotion-dependent information and it eliminates speaker-dependent information. And then we use an adversarial learning approach for that. So with respect to this adversarial learning approach, we tried to maximize this optimization function that tried to essentially maximize emotion-dependent loss and minimize speaker-dependent loss. And there is also some details about how this can be trained more efficiently. So we used an iterative algorithm in order to train this more efficiently, rather than just training all the parts of the network together. And this is an iterative algorithm, and I'm more than happy to discuss this further at the end. So what we found there was that so this with the green is our proposed approach. So in our proposed approach, this is just the emotion recognition from the convolutional neural network. This is the face recognition that results when this convolutional neural network that we learn from the adversarial learning is being trained for face. So we understand that in this case, face-dependent information is not preserved that much. But we understand, though, also that the face-dependent information is not being preserved when we retrain for face. So that was something that was actually very important to us. And that's the emotion-specific information that is being learned from the adversarial learning from the convolutional neural network. So these are some examples that we got. These are our original images, and these were the transformation from the proposed adversarial learning approach. So we see that we have different parts of the image that are being highlighted, but might not be as indicative of facial characteristics and essentially the contour of the face as compared to this emotion-specific machine learning model that has been trained solely for emotion recognition. We see that this emotion-specific machine learning model preserves some face contours as well as some characteristics of the face. And these are just the optimization losses. So this is optimization loss for emotion, and this is optimization loss for face, which increases the more we train, which is essentially what we wanted to have. So this is, again, the study on privacy preservation. It's a very preliminary study. We only tried to see how this would play out in very well-defined and very constrained images for emotion recognition. We are planning to extend that for spontaneous emotional expressions. We are also planning to perform perceptual experiments on how well people would feel about these transformed images being shared rather than the original images. And of course, we're trying to see how this can be translated to speech. So on that note, we're also working on several applications with respect to trying to quantify, trying to promote well-being for elderly adults, trying to promote performance and stress in office environments, as well as trying to see how different aspects of performance are affected by different environmental factors. That was, to sum up, that was our talk. Overall, we tried to see how we can combine multimodal sets of information and knowledge-driven models, theory-driven models, as well as data-driven and machine learning solutions in order to open up new possibilities for health, education, and well-being. And with that, that was the end of the of course, I would like to thank here all the members of my lab who really contributed, and some of the funding agencies. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions in the last couple of minutes that are left.
Okay. Thank you, Theodora. That's a very good talk. And we have a few questions here in the chat. I don't know if you can see. Phil Lacas has a question. I can read it to you if you're...
I can see. So okay. Thank you so much. So there is a question about the clustered subpopulation. As other features in your modeling also create separate model, you haven't mentioned the goodness of fit metrics for these clusters. Yes, so we try to measure, in the papers we have some of the goodness of fit metrics with these clusters. We also tried to follow best practices using the elbow method on trying to see what would be the best number of clusters for these. We definitely saw that in the couples data, goodness of fit clusters, or the goodness of fit was better compared to the public speaking data, where it was a more homogeneous population, it was student population, and therefore the clusters were not that separable. I hope this...
There was one more question about that from Salvador.
Has a critical point been discovered or developed in psychological learning models, machine learning, that allows the development of self-awareness within a learning system, allowing it to imprint these characteristics of within its own critical thinking analysis and data analysis you spoke of ensemble dynamics. How does phase-space analysis infer the evolution of these theories? So I'm not sure what phase-space analysis is. I'm more than happy to discuss more about that because I really don't know what this is. The overall goal there is to try to build a system that can learn from a person, and then it can provide better decisions depending on the person. So that's the overall goal here, and I'm more than happy to talk more about that, Salvador, as well.
A few more questions from Phil, I believe.
During the presentation anxiety, did you control for audience engagement? Yes. So we have an extended version of this that has been submitted to a journal now that we tried to see. So first of all, for the real life audience, what we tried to do is that we tried to keep the audience as neutral as possible because it was just a comparison. So we wanted to see just the baseline before and the baseline after. So we said to the real life audience to be as neutral as possible there. For the VR audience, we also, the VR settings allowed us to have different audience reactions. So we had friendly, unfriendly audience, interested, uninterested, and we also controlled for different rooms. So whether it is a big conference room, a smaller classroom, and a smaller conference room. We couldn't find, I think it was mostly because we had a lot of settings and we only had 50 participants, that we really couldn't find significant differences among the settings. However, we really found that, for example, there was a specific type of setting where it was a conference room and the audience was right next to the presenter. The presenter was just sitting, they started in a seated position. So at that point, we could really see physiological reactivity that spiked, and we also saw the same things in self-reports. So in terms of formally controlling for that, we really didn't see a lot of effect, but I think it was just because we didn't have a lot of subjects and the control conditions were a lot. Yeah. The PCA analysis showed perfect separation between classes. This usually happens when a single variable is separately correlated to the outcomes. Why not use that single variable? So the thing is that the single variable in the couples was the variables that were related to relationship satisfaction and avoidance. That was only one variable that was recorded in the beginning of the experiment. The thing is that even couples who are highly satisfied from their relationship, still they had hours in which they had a conflict and hours in which they didn't have a conflict. So even with that, like just having this single variable wouldn't predict. But I completely agree with you that we have just that we could have performed machine learning experiments where we could just use this relationship satisfaction and avoidance variables in order to predict conflict. But again, conflict is not, so one couple has only one value of these variables, but conflict, one couple can have both conflict and non-conflict samples. So that's why the association would not be one-to-one here.
Okay. Thank you, Theodora. I don't see other questions. I think Phil had one more, probably. I don't know if you already answered this question. About anxiety results. I think you probably did. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your presentation today.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So we hope to see you in person pretty soon.
I would love that. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. It was very nice to see you.